Good evening. Welcome to tonight's program. My name is Niamh King. I'm the Vice President for Programs here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. We're delighted that you're here. If you wouldn't mind, please silencing your phones. You don't have to turn them off because you may tweet during the program because this program's on the record, but please feel free to tweet, but make sure they're turned off. We're thrilled to welcome Adam Posen here to our stage tonight. And of course, we want to thank Zurich for their very generous sponsorship of the Global Economy Series, which is now in its 11th season. So thank you very much, Zurich. And also our media sponsor, the Financial Times. There are some copies out the back if you haven't received one already. Our own Dick Longworth will be doing a write-up of the program. It'll be online tomorrow. I won't give a specific time, but Dick always keeps to his times because he's a journalist. It should be up by about 11. So that's a great record of the event to send to your friends or to keep for yourself. A couple of upcoming programs you might be interested in. Many of you may recall the first of our Zurich series speakers was Mr. Martin Wolf from the Financial Times, and his wife will be back this week on Thursday, February 11th, to talk about breaking the glass ceiling. She wrote a terrific book called The Double X Factor, and she'll be discussing the challenges facing women in the working world in the 21st century. Then on March 18th, we have a members-only program with His Royal Highness Prince Turki Al Faisal. I would strongly encourage you to sign up for this program. It'll definitely sell out by the end of the week, and you have to be a member to do it, so you can see the website for more information on that. He'll be talking about Saudi Arabia and the Arab world. And then our last program of this season for the Global Economy Series is with Jean-Claude Trichet, as many of you know, the former ECB president. He'll be here to talk about the crisis of advanced economies. I'll be back up for the Q&A, but if you wouldn't mind, please join me in welcoming the EVP and Chief Actuary for Zurich North America Commercial, Bob Effinger. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Zurich and the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, I would like to thank you for joining us for the second program of our spring series on the global economy. Zurich is pleased to support this important ongoing series at the Chicago Council. Our organizations together recognize the need to lead discussions on the increased opportunities and the increased frequency, severity, and amplification of risks throughout the world economy. Addressing these issues requires a multi-stakeholder response. Zurich and the Council play a key role in highlighting these pressure points. Earlier this spring, we were delighted to host the renowned journalist and one of Canada's newest parliamentarians, Chrystia Freeland. Chrystia discussed the global income equality, which was recently identified by the World Economic Forum as an emerging societal risk in 2014. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome Adam Posen. Adam is an expert on macroeconomic policy, central banking, financial crisis, and the economies of Europe, Japan, and the US. While the American economic dominance was a defining characteristic of the 20th century global economy, our shrinking size and income relative to the emerging countries of the world in the 21st century could challenge that status. According to Adam, our self-inflicted wounds like the October ceiling and the sequester battles, the October debt ceiling and the sequester battles could accelerate America's decline. If this trend continues and competitive emerging markets increasingly close the gap with the US and other advanced economies, what should we expect from the resulting multipolar global economy? Who will be the unexpected winners and the losers? And what are the policies most likely to succeed? I look forward to Adam's perspectives on these and other themes this evening. Now let me briefly introduce him to you. Adam Posen is president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, which is one of the world's leading think tanks in global economics. Adam also advises the US Congressional Budget Office and has served as an external member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee by appointment of the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer. He has co-authored a reform program for federal policy with Ben Bernanke, consulted for the UK Cabinet Office on the London G20 Summit of 2009, and counseled the Koizumi government of Japan. He appears frequently on Bloomberg, CNBC, and NPR. And his commentary is published regularly in the world's leading newspapers. Adam, we are delighted to host you this evening. As global organizations with Chicago roots, Zurich and the Chicago Council hope your assessment is not all doom and gloom, and that we can see a bright future through an increasingly interconnected world. Thank you for taking the time to visit us in Chicago. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Adam Posen.
Thank you all very much for coming out tonight, and thanks especially to Bob and to Zurich for letting me invade their series. Also thanks to Ms. King and the council, who've been very gracious to me for the last day or so while we've been working together. I didn't have the good fortune to be a Chicagoan, but my wife and both her parents grew up here, and it's a particular point of pleasure for me to get to speak to the Chicago Council. But of course also I've known many of the past and present leaders of the council, and we had a great breakfast this morning with Mike Moskow, former president of Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, and this is an organization that really mobilizes people, and I'm very glad to see the kind of crowd that we were able to get tonight. I appreciate your time. In the spirit of what Bob said, I actually don't intend to be doom and gloom. Somehow, between my office and their office, we had sort of an advertisement that made it sound like I'm predicting the end of the world. And I would have done that 3 years ago, but now everything's fine. So what I really want to emphasize is that we are moving into a world that I think is getting back to the more normal economics, which is a world that is more positive sum. In other words, that more than one country, more than one people, more than one group can gain at the same time. Not everything is at everybody else's expense. And that is, excuse me, fundamentally probably a more optimistic message than sometimes people give you about the world economy. It means my books don't become bestsellers, but I hope it will be at least of use to you all. But let me first start by addressing a question which I guess each of you already addressed, so maybe this is redundant, but why bother to listen to an economist? Part of the record of economists over the last few years has not been very good. At least that's the perception. While I was living in the United Kingdom, serving at the Bank of England, as Bob kindly mentioned, Queen Elizabeth II actually sent out a public call and said to some of the leading economists in Britain, why did you all miss this happening? Why did you all get it wrong? And so, you know, I could say, make some crack about all of you coming to listen to an economist being the triumph of faith over experience or something like that. But I guess, even though you've already revealed the fact that you think there is something to be learned, I just want to preempt some skepticism by making a probably somewhat controversial claim. There was a group of economists who largely got it right. Not perfectly by any means. In particular, nobody, I think, really foresaw just how bad all the things that came together in 2008, 2009 would prove to be. But there was a group of economists, including some very famous names, people like Joseph Stiglitz or Paul Krugman, but also the former UChicago Professor Raghu Rajan, who I think many of you have seen speak, and others of less note, such as myself in certain limited ways, who did broadly see a storm coming, did broadly see that excessive financial deregulation was a major problem, did broadly see that there was too laissez-faire an approach heading into the crisis, did broadly see that this was going to be a very large recession, and did broadly have the right policy prescriptions. Again, not everything perfect by any means, but better than, say, weather forecasters, which is actually, in a sense, the right benchmark, because you're trying to look at very complex systems and that are with forces that are out of any one person's control, and figure out the best way to forecast and respond. And I say that not to be defensive, and I certainly say that not to brag, because there were plenty of things I got wrong. But just to say that I think sometimes there is this tendency to, I'll show my age now, to McNeil-Lehrer the economics conversation, that there's two sides to every issue, that if I appear on what's now the NewsHour with God knows who, they have to have John Taylor from the Republican Stanford Hoover Institution on the other side. And I'm afraid on some of these issues, it's not physics, but there aren't two equally legitimate sides. And for political reasons, that doesn't get said often enough. Or when it gets said in a very shrill way, as my friends Brad DeLong or Paul Krugman do online, and it's understandable that at some point people start sticking their fingers in their ears and saying enough already. But so without a question of point scoring, without a question of voting, because as will be probably apparent by the end of my talk, I'm quite annoyed with the Obama administration and the Democrats in Congress on trade. I would encourage all of you to look past some of the bomb throwing and realize that there is sort of a reasonably coherent school of economic analysis that does understand what happened. And you don't have to sort of throw up your hands. And that's that school of thought that I'm going to be drawing on, in part, for my remarks tonight. Let me just talk about what I guess would be 5 big issues. I had trouble choosing. I consulted with my wife, Jennifer. I consulted with the council on what were the right things. So let me stress, I guess, 5 issues rather than try and make one general theme. The first is to take you through what I think is going on in the so-called emerging markets and this very visible signs of instability we're seeing now. How bad is that and how likely is it to persist? The second, picking up on something Bob said, is to look at some of the self-inflicted wounds the U.S. has done itself, and particularly in fiscal terms over the last few years, and what that prospects are going forward. The third is to address an issue which I know not only Zurich, but its millions of customers are quite concerned with, which is financial stability. Are we vulnerable to a rerun of what we saw a few years ago in broad terms? Fourth, talk a little bit more about trade, what economists refer to as the real side as opposed to the financial or monetary side of the economy, where, as I mentioned, and my colleague Phil Livy, who's here at the council, I think shares many of these views, are getting a little bit frustrated with U.S. policy. And then finally, talk a bit about the source of what many people consider a threat in the world economy, China, and say just a few words about why, even if they want to be a threat, they're not, or at least not as bad as anybody thinks. So first about emerging markets. How many of you heard or have used the acronym BRICS to refer to emerging markets? Yeah, okay. This is how to get rich and famous. Come up with a good acronym. So a few years ago, the former chief economist of Goldman Sachs coined this term BRICS to represent the major emerging markets: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and depending on what mood you're in, usually South Africa, although you could say South anything with the S. And this was supposed to be the core of the new world economy, and everything was great. And lately, things aren't going so well there. So how should we think about the kinds of trouble we're seeing in emerging markets today? And I would argue it's useful to break down emerging markets into 3 categories. There's essentially China, which is its own category. There's what's left of the BRICS when you take out China, or as I call it, the spare ribs. That's Russia, India, Brazil, South Africa. And that's, of course, what's left over after you've eaten the good part. And then below, in some sense, the radar and below the ribs is the beating heart, which is the mid-market emerging markets. The Polands, the Indonesias, the Ugandas, the Chiles. And you know, every country has its own story, but I think we can usefully break it down to these 3 classes and just take you through that. So in terms of China, in its own right, we all have to appreciate what a miracle China has been over the last now almost 30 years. And I think most people in this room probably do. And it's very hard to get past the platitudes about it. But it is an extraordinary achievement in human history to raise several hundred million people out of poverty, and to do so in a through means of getting more market-oriented. This is for real. This is extraordinary. What has happened now in China is that they are running into trouble continuing along the same exact path they've been on. What does that mean? Well, there's obviously, for those of you who've been literally running out of oxygen, but there's also just the idea that they've been piling up capacity in heavy industries like steel. 10 out of every 11 tons of steel produced in the world is made in China, say. I mean, some ridiculous number. And they can't just keep doing this. You can't just keep growing by doing this. And so the question is, could they adjust? And at the same time, on the financial side of the economy, they've really made it very difficult for their individuals who save a lot, their households, to get any return on their savings. Think back, those of you who are old enough, remember Regulation Q in the US back in the early 70s, and it was very limited what interest rate you could get at your bank account. Same thing in China, much lower. And that can't go on forever either. And so the question has been, how do they make the shift? And the pessimistic view of the shift is, well, they can't do it because the special interests, the big industries won't let them, because the government is too concerned about instability and won't make the shift, because every country slows down a lot as it gets richer. The low-hanging fruit, the easy stuff to catch up with goes away. And also, of course, they are still a communist dictatorship, so that kind of interferes with decision-making. And so for these reasons, China must slow down a lot and might even slow down abruptly in the next couple of years. There's some merit to these claims, but my colleagues and I at the Peterson Institute, and in particular, we have, I would argue, the best person on the Chinese economy in the US, a man named Nicholas Lardy. Please check out our website. Would argue that this is overdone, that the ability of the Chinese government top-down to change is not easy, but is actually easier in many ways than say, in Japan or the US, that the low-hanging fruit is to some degree still out there because they still have hundreds of millions of people in the rural hinterlands who have to be urbanized, have to be brought into the main economy. They still have underprovided a lot of public services and infrastructure for the main part of the economy. And as a result, this sort of inherent slowdown doesn't seem to be, for us, I don't believe, a binding rule on China yet. So that's not to say China can go on growing forever at 10% a year, but it says that China's slowdown right now is probably as much through intentional policy of trying to get the economy on the right track as through accident, and that the slowdown, therefore, is probably temporary. And so when you look at China, I would actually suggest the next few years are probably pretty good. When you look at the ribs, it's not so good. But it's not so good in a very boring way. So if you look back, part of what happened in 08, 09 was, despite my claims of, some economists understanding what happened, it was still something different, fresh, scary in various ways. What's going on now in Russia, India, Brazil, South Africa is classic developing country problem. It's very similar to cycles these countries and others have seen in the 80s and 90s. They essentially rode a boom too long, spent too much money, and then didn't bother to slow down the economy in the way they should have when they got too far. So, I mean, think of the US in the late 70s, and then eventually you have to bring in Paul Volcker, and Volcker has to put up interest rates a lot to get the economy's inflation rate down, and you have to do some pretty draconian things to get the budget back into shape because you've been living beyond your means for a few years and everybody's having a party. I mean, 1979 was not exactly a party, but in economic terms, that's what was going on. And broadly speaking, that was the history of Latin America for much of the 80s and 90s, for example, including Brazil. And what we've seen over the last few years is essentially that for Russia, for India, for South Africa, and especially for Brazil. That there was a bit of a boom, credit conditions were easy because money was leaving the US. India is a net importer of commodities, so it didn't help India, but for Brazil, South Africa, Russia, having high commodity prices were helpful, and the governments went on a spending spree and gave people money, and the central banks didn't tighten rates, and we've just had a boom that goes too far. Now, why am I belaboring this point? Because it means it's very soluble. This isn't a fundamental breakdown. This isn't a policy challenge we're unfamiliar with. This is a rerun. The complication is that in all these countries, just as it always seems, there are elections around the corner. An election coming up in Brazil, an election coming up in India. No elections matter in Russia, but anyway. And so some of these policymakers, including people like Raghu Rajan, seem to be reluctant to take the steps that most of the markets and most of the economics community knows are necessary. And so the news there is not great. It means that if they get their act together and start tightening quickly, you'll have a couple bad years and things will be okay. And if they don't get their act together and drag it out, you'll have a couple bad years and things will start getting out of hand. But it's not a global threat. It's not some irreversible problem. It's just a bad stretch. And I think that's the way to see it. But then, and I'm worried I'm going on a little too long about this first point, and I apologize, but then you've got the mid-majors. And as my colleague Arvind Subramanian, who I think has spoken out here before, has emphasized, the story of leaps forward in growth in developing countries is really a story about liberalization, is really a story about countries deciding to move to the market in good ways, reduce corruption, reduce government interference. Now again, I can be for all kinds of government interference in an advanced economy like the US, but when you're talking about an Argentina, a Zimbabwe, you know, there's a long way to go getting the government out of the economy. And it's not the commodity cycle, it's not cheap credit from the US. You can date the acceleration in growth in each of these countries to when they start changing their policies. And Arvind's done some very interesting work on this. He's not alone. Others have documented this. And so that actually is a very hopeful message, because if you look around, not all, but much of Central and Latin America, Mexico, Chile, Colombia, a few others, you look around most of Eastern Europe, not Ukraine, obviously, not Hungary, but Czech Republic, Slovenia, Slovakia, Poland, the Baltics. You look around even a surprising amount of sub-Saharan Africa, and you see a bunch of countries that are sticking largely to pro-market, reasonable policies, even as times have changed. And so the prospects for them, I would argue, and I think most of us would believe, are actually still very strong. So don't be misled by the BRICS. Think about the spare ribs, think about China, think about the mid-majors, and everything's okay. Now what about the US? As Bob mentioned, and some of you may have seen, at least I hope some of you have seen, we just put out a very brief argumentative piece on how much damage the US government was doing to all of us by the games played over the debt ceiling. As I was quoted somewhere saying, you know, part of what has always advantaged the US for the last 50 or 100 years is that our governance is better. Our Congress would pass budgets. We were not Argentina or Greece. And we were now, for the last year or two, sort of voluntarily throwing that advantage away when there was no compelling economic reason not to pass budgets. It was just pure political spite. And this has costs. But the flip side of that, which I want to emphasize, is that the fundamental fiscal soundness of the US is actually quite strong. And you will hear a lot of people who will tell you in great detail that if you add up every Medicare and Social Security payment from now till the end of time, the US is broke, or that we have all these state and local governments, of course I know there's a little problem here in Illinois, that have debt issues, that we can't make our payments on this, that, and the other. And the facts are actually a little different than that. We can't make our payments to some degree, although it's vastly exaggerated, largely because the country has been unwilling to raise taxes to anything like a normal level. Martin Wolf, who you're going to be seeing, I guess, in a few days, has written about this and points out that there's just sort of this underlying gap that it seems like federal taxes in the US hit a ceiling at about 18.5% of GDP, varies a bit over the cycle. And federal expenditures hit a floor at 21, 22% of GDP, and that means you got a gap of 3 or 4% of GDP every year. Now, that's not good, but think of it as the person who basically is buying Starbucks lattes every day and could choose to take that money and brew coffee at home instead. And if they did that every day of the year, it would add up. I mean, I don't mean to be too simple-minded about it, but it really is that. Some very incremental, not terribly large changes to the US tax code could make a huge difference. And that's part of the reason markets, I see somebody shaking their head, I regret that they're that ill-informed. The reality is simply that the structural deficit in the US is somewhere between 2.5% and 3% of GDP a year. And that is not a very large number when the economy is growing at least 2% a year. And you can raise taxes a couple percent of GDP. Probably the best way to do it would be a carbon tax. The second best way to do it would be some sort of national sales tax with rebates for poor people. And both of those would require no administrative headaches and no red tape and no anything. And that would be enough, basically, to balance the books. And then you say, well, what about healthcare? Well, healthcare is very interesting. It's not my area of expertise, thank God. But as Bob mentioned, I have the privilege to serve on the panel of economic advisors to the Congressional Budget Office, which really is a public service organization, does great work on this. And if you go through the healthcare economics, there are a number of things that stand out for you. But again, let me distill it down. We have a really stupid system. It's like you go to China and you say, it's really dumb you don't let people own land. Or you go to Japan and you say, it's really dumb you don't employ women and you don't let in foreign rice. And if you just employed women and let in foreign rice, the following prices would drop, the following income would rise. It's all done. It's easy. In the US, as complicated as we make it, it really is that way. The amount we waste on healthcare in this country is so out of whack with every other country on earth that there is 3 or 4% of GDP a year that some relatively straightforward reforms would get you. And so this notion that the healthcare is automatically inherently unsustainable is simply false, or rather it's misleading. It's only unsustainable if we don't ever fix anything. Now, an interesting question is how much the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, goes towards fixing it. And that is a very detailed question, and it's one worth talking about. I can go into it if people are interested. I'm sure there are people in the room who know it better than I do. The bottom line is Obamacare, by all projections and analyses to date, is helping. It doesn't solve the problem by any means, but it's helping. Full stop. So we should be embarrassed and concerned about bad US governance, but we don't need to get ourselves totally worried about US debt. So what about financial stability? Financial stability probably sounds euphemistic to many of you. It is the main term of economic policy discussion nowadays. What is financial stability? Well, financial stability, roughly defined as the absence of financial crisis. What is financial crisis? What we saw in 2008, 2009. The worst things that can happen to an economy generally occur in financial crises. Cultural revolution might be worse, but within normal bounds of economies. What can one do about a financial crisis? How does one preempt it? That's the topic of financial stability. And broadly speaking, there are 3 complementary avenues to how you get to financial stability. One is you make sure that the people participating in the system, be they financial intermediaries like banks, be they individual investors, have enough savings or capital, if they're companies, on hand to cover expected losses. That sounds relatively straightforward, But there was an extended period there in the mid-2000s when we and people in the UK and a few other countries actively encouraged both homeowners to take out mortgages based on no income or very small down payments, and encouraged financial institutions to leverage up many times their base capital. Insurance companies, I'm not saying this just to be nice to our hosts, insurance companies largely did not do that. AIG did that because they were not acting like an insurance company. So the biggest thing, the first step, is have enough savings, have enough capital. And there's a very provocative book by the Stanford academic Anat Admati and her co-author Martin Hellweg called The Banker's New Clothes, which discusses this issue, and this is very good on this. But there is an argument that you can save too much, that you may not save against the right events, that self-insurance is not necessarily the best way to go. So the second piece is you need adequate regulation. Now, the trick with adequate regulation is nobody knows what's adequate without being too much. And there is an understandable cynicism on the part of large parts of the American public, shared by such people as Paul Volcker, that whatever it is we had in the past was too little, and that what we lose by having too much isn't worth very much. But if you fight your way through some of the extreme propaganda from certain interest groups, there is a core of financial innovation, and more importantly, of flexible financial markets that is useful in a very fundamental way to the resilience and the growth of the modern economy. And so vast forests of trees, of paper, vast amounts of electronic messages, however you would measure them, have been killed over the last 3 years in a global effort to figure out what is the right amount of regulation and where to put it. And the simple answer is, or not simple answer, it's not an answer, simple assessment, is we've made good progress on the saving enough front, both in terms of what regulators are forcing companies to do and in terms of what households have done to rebuild their savings. We've made decent progress on regulation, but it is still quite spotty. And to give my own personal two-sentence summary, we've gone too far in imposing regulations fit for banks on non-bank financial actors, pension funds, insurers, hedge funds, and so on. It really was banks that were the problem. But at the same time, we haven't gone far enough in taking on the structure of the system. So one of the things that's very interesting, and forgive me if I'm using terms that don't seem to make sense, so let me try to explain what I mean by structure. Oops, that's not structure. It would not be unreasonable for the intelligent member of this audience to look around now and say, geez, the exact same large banks are doing almost the exact same kinds of business they were 6 years ago. Nothing has changed. That's, in a nutshell, is the structure argument. And the well-intentioned regulators, and I was chairing a group of them at Davos a few weeks ago, so I'm very up to date on what they think. The well-intentioned regulators will say something just completely at a right angle to it. They will say, that's not really the point. We don't need to regulate forms of behavior. We don't need to regulate forms of financial system. We just need to make sure they have enough capital, and we just need to make sure that when they get into trouble, we can shut them down. If we're sufficiently credible that we can shut them down when they get into trouble, they won't get out of hand and they'll behave better. And that point of view seems to have, at least for the time being, completely won the day in regulatory circles. And so, again, for those of you who followed this, some of you may remember there was this law that used to exist in the US called Glass-Steagall that separated certain kinds of banking from other kinds of banking, and there were various rules not allowing one financial institution to get into too many different things, and there were restrictions on what banks could do, and those were all consciously weakened by the Congress and by the Greenspan Fed over the course of the 90s into the early 2000s. And we have done very little to put any of that back. And as I said, there is a large part of the expert community who thinks that's not important. There are some of us, myself included, who think that this is still a fundamental failure, and we have to look at it. So that leads to, for those of you who are keeping count of my lists within lists, the third piece, to me, of financial stability, which I think is underappreciated, and that is diversity. You need a financial system that's diverse in number and in type, such that if one particular set of activities gets impaired, there are other people, other institutions that can pick it up. And so this means you don't want to end up like my friends in the UK did with 4 big banks who do everything. You want there to be competition. You want there to be possibilities. And you don't want to end up like France did with dependent on solely big commercial banks. You want to be like the US, frankly, and have big banks, small banks, community banks, hedge funds, private equity, credit unions, whole variety. And one of the things that became clear during the crisis, in my opinion, and research I've done, is that those countries that had more diversified financial systems, US and Germany notably, either weathered or recovered from the crisis much more quickly than those countries which had highly concentrated or non-diversified financial systems, which the UK is one and Japan during its time was another. So what does that tell you about financial stability? We are definitely in much better shape than we were 5 years ago. The amount of leverage in the system is much lower. The amount of scrutiny, at least for the time being, on the financial system is much higher. And most importantly, households and financial intermediaries have a lot more capital. But there are still problems out there. There's over-regulation in some sectors, and I would argue under-regulation in others. All right. Let me skip over trade just for the sake of time. I will count on friends in the audience to raise it. Let me finally talk a bit about China. So I already gave you sort of our Institute's house view that we're broadly bullish on China for both the short and the medium term, meaning both the next year and the next several years. So does that make me a panda hugger, as the Congress would have certain people labeled soft on China, endangering us all? As I said at the start, I think the important point to understand is that even if the Chinese government, or let's be realistic, parts of the Chinese government would like to pursue a more confrontational policy with the US, and certainly have no scruples about taking advantage of the US or other countries, the extent to which they can do us damage in economic terms is actually rather limited. Now, let me try to explain why. Usually we speak about essentially 3 ways. I guess I am going to talk about trade in a sense. 3 ways in which China can do us economic harm. The first is undercut us on price because they have cheap labor, and therefore our people can't compete, and it's just unfair. And the variant on that is they have government-owned or partially owned and subsidized companies who compete with our private sector companies, and so those companies get a subsidy, and so it's unfair competition, something bad happens. The second way in which China is sometimes posited as being a threat to us economically is that they're ripping off our intellectual property. They're ripping off our innovations, they're ripping off our technology, they're ripping off our copyrights, and that's stealing, and that's just bad. And then the third way in which it's often said that China is dangerous economically for the US. Again, I'm not addressing issues of Chinese warships in the Pacific. That's not my area, and I'm not pretending that isn't something to take seriously. I'm just talking narrowly economically. The third way in which it's posited sometimes that China can hurt us economically is that they will grab markets or resources that we don't, and then exclude us from access to them. They will invest in Angola and get all the copper or uranium or whatever it is there, and we will not get that stuff. Now, I want to be clear. I have no difficulty believing that there are large parts of Chinese government and Chinese business community who think this way, and that their intentions towards the US economy may indeed be, at best, uncaring and at worst quite malevolent. That's not my issue. The issue is that I don't think any of these threats are terribly threatening, and that there are very simple things we can do about them that, within context, are overreacting to them is outweighed by the benefits of ongoing economic relations with China in a broader sense. So on the first point, are they just too cheap? Do they subsidize their exports, and so on? If you look at the history of the last 150 years, the US, basically since after the Civil War, certainly since 1900, but probably since after the Civil War, has been the cutting edge, relatively high-wage, high-tech economy. And throughout this period, we have whined repeatedly that the Germans were stealing our stuff, the French were stealing our stuff, the Japanese were stealing our stuff, the Koreans were stealing our stuff, the Mexicans were stealing our stuff, and now the Chinese are stealing our stuff. And they're stealing our stuff because they're too cheap and because they're stealing intellectual property. So first, about the too cheap. It doesn't really work that way. Except for a couple of industries, a couple very specific jobs where Americans have already gotten out, like literally picking crops. American citizens, American workers do not compete on price. You compete on some combination of the wage that you have and the value of the company and the institution you work for and the capital around you and the knowledge and skills that you have and the quality control that goes with being an American product, and so on and so on. It's no different than competition within the US. Yes, Walmart beats some people, but it doesn't always beat Neiman Marcus. There are different forms of competition. And it is probably a good thing that there are very few American citizens who have to be paid so little as to pick crops or go down into coal mines in very bad ways nowadays. That is the nature of economic development. The people get richer over time, and unfortunately, in a sense, there are people poorer down the value chain who will do those messy jobs. But fortunately, that's how they, in turn, get richer and move their way up. And that's why Germany and Japan and Korea and Brazil and now China have all seen their wages rise steadily. And as their wages rise steadily, they buy more of our stuff, they compete more fairly, and they're richer, and the world's a better place. This labor fallacy is one that I'm doing a very bad job of killing tonight, but it is something a universal group of economists would beg for the chance to kill. It's just not true. It's just not the way the world works. Competition takes place on many dimensions, and competing on a low-wage basis as a rich country is a way to hurt yourself, not to help yourself. What about intellectual property? That's a more serious issue. And that's something where there is a very big difference between the individual company's welfare or well-being and the country's well-being. So there is no question that Chinese companies, Chinese government are stealing intellectual property from the US, from the West. And this is not going to make me popular saying this, but anyway. And this runs the gamut from, as many people in this room may have experienced, you build a plant in China for your particular company's production, and soon there is an exactly similar plant being built 1 mile down the road by people who had been working for you, and your processes and your everything moves down the road. There is direct rip-offs of people pirating movies or pirating music or pirating Louis Vuitton bags, or in the US, I guess, Coach bags. We're staying here on top of Water Tower Place, so I'm trying to make good references. There is cyber theft. There are indeed Chinese organizations, some of which are official, some of which are commercial, some of which are military, people with security clearances, which I don't have, know the difference, but who are out there literally breaking into American companies and labs and stealing information. This is all true, okay? And I'm not going to make light of it. But what we have to understand is that there has only been a very brief period in human history in which intellectual property rights were well protected. And that was basically when the US completely dominated science and completely dominated the military of the world. It was basically the period from the 1950 to 1970. Nobody has ever successfully really protected intellectual property. Now, why am I saying this? Because at some point when you're making policy, when you're planning ahead, when you're weighing pros and cons, you have to be realistic about what's attainable. And the fact is, so we had this brief period when the US could literally send warships into Nicaragua if somebody was ripping off the Chiquita banana trademark, where we could literally threaten a highly dependent militarily Japanese country government. We don't want to see you ripping off our Boeing parts. But the fact is, all periods before and since that period, intellectual property right development is extremely spotty. Protection, excuse me, is extremely spotty. For those of you who remember your American history, and this isn't about moral equivalence, this is just reality check, you will remember the well-documented fact that the Industrial Revolution starts in the US by US entrepreneurs stealing the designs of the bobbins and the other textile weaving machinery from the UK, bringing them to Massachusetts and throughout the US and creating this. And this is seen as a great victory by the US because the British had this evil thing called the Navigation Acts, which didn't let anybody get access to British technology, and we broke the blockade. Good for us. That's intellectual property theft. And that was the basis for our Industrial Revolution. So again, the issue, what I want to say is it's not that the threat isn't there. It's that formal protections of intellectual property have never been strong except for this brief golden moment of US dominance. And so what you have is a number of companies adapting and figuring out ways to make it difficult, more and less difficult to steal, and more and less difficult to reproduce, or making their brands very valuable so that people in China around the world really don't want a Coach bag knockoff. They want a genuine Coach with the genuine tag on it. Or, particularly, as we move into service industries for an increasing part of employment, that you want there's nothing to steal. There's nothing, you can't replace easily what a good actuary or a good chef or a good architect does. You can't just steal that. So again, I'm not trying to be Pollyannish, but I want to give you a reality check that this isn't the threat to the US that some people make it out to be. The final thing, I guess, to say about China, and this leads into my last sort of philosophical point, is in the end, to be true to our values, we have to believe that other human beings escaping poverty is a good thing. Full stop. I can argue that it has benefits for us because it leads to less disease and more demand for our goods and more stability around the world and sometimes better political relations and sometimes better treatment of their people and so on. But it just is a moral imperative. It's good to see human beings get out of poverty. And this has to be, for all the terrible things that happened over the last few years in the global economy, for all the perception that people have of threats from the global economy, and this worry that somehow the US is being taken advantage of, I ask you all to appreciate the very simple fact that there's roughly 1.2 billion people in China, India, Eastern Europe, and Latin America who are now living at standards of living that you would not enjoy, but you would find human and acceptable, and who within living memory were not. And this came without any real cost to the US, to you as human beings, and in some ways I would argue benefits. And ultimately, I have to believe that that is a triumph of human history, that there are fewer human beings living in true poverty at this moment by a vast number as a share, either in absolute terms or as a share of the world population, than ever before. And broadly speaking, the US is much richer now than when that process started. Bob and the Vice President asked me to be somewhat upbeat, and you're calling this a spring series. That's pretty upbeat. So let me conclude there. The world is not that scary a place in economic terms. The emerging markets, there are places making mistakes, but they're mistakes we understand. The US, we aren't doing as well as we should be doing, but we are grappling, and we're not out of control, and we have the money available to deal with what we need to deal with. The financial stability of the world is by no means perfect, but it is much stronger than it was a few years ago in very real ways. China's development is actually a good thing for humanity, and there are ways in which they wish to threaten us, but the threat is quite exaggerated and pales in comparison to the benefits of having a world out there where China and other human beings are engaged in the market and engaged in commerce. So things are pretty good. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Posen. Now we'd like to throw it out to the audience for questions. If you could please raise your arm, wait for the mic, and make sure your question's a question. That'd be great. Yeah, we'll start off here in the front row, please. Just 1 minute with the mic's there. Thanks.
Yes, China has been buying a lot of gold recently. What is your feelings on gold and silver at this point?
My wife is laughing. She knows my feelings on gold and silver. Gold is, as John Maynard Keynes said, a barbarous relic. It is something that people fly into when they are frightened, and they foolishly think that it has some intrinsic value, which it does not. China has been buying gold and silver, but more importantly, China has been buying huge amounts of natural resources. They've been investing in mining and energy projects and some agriculture around the world, particularly in South Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Brazil. The economist in me and the amateur historian in me says, this is actually a good thing. Because what you're going to do is China is recycling some of those savings it's built up and is increasing global supply of some of these goods. It's digging more of it out of the ground. It's getting more of it out there. If they insist on buying up everything that's dug up in Angola, that's fine, because then there's all the other producers out there more for us. You can come up with scenarios. There is a very limited number of specific materials where there are countably finite sources. So there's a particular metal that's used in catalytic converters. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name. That there's like only 2 mines in the world, and one is in Central Africa and one is in Russia. There are a couple things like that where one can legitimately worry. I'm not trying to project onto you, I'm just trying to make a point here. One can legitimately worry that people have to have access to it. But the vast, vast bulk of natural resources, including gold, including silver, the supply, in fact, including even those things called rare earths, the supply is actually elastic, which in economics terms means that if the price goes up enough, you will generate more supply. So, you know, and frankly, if I want again, to sound very obnoxious for a second, if I want the Chinese government to learn that not everything goes their way, let them do in Latin America, let them do in sub-Saharan Africa what the Americans experienced in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in Latin America. That you buy these places and you think you're running the government and you think you've got a sweetheart deal, and in the end it comes back to bite you. I'm very happy to have the Chinese government go learn that lesson and build a few hospitals in Angola while they do it.
Thank you. Right here in the front row, please. Ken Dam.
Hi, Ken. Very generous of former Secretary Dam to take the time to listen. Thank you.
You're kidding me. We're delighted that you were able to come. You have some experience in England with monetary policy formation.
Yeah.
We've been fixated in the United States with the transition between Bernanke and Yellen and all of the policy issues involved there. Could you give us a little perspective on the differences and the similarities of the policy issues?
Of course. Let me just say for the record, as most of you I'm sure know, Ken Dam is, in addition to being a leading legal academic, is a very distinguished public servant, and I had the opportunity to interact with him a bit a decade ago during the Bush administration. It's nice of you to come. I hope the fact that you're asking that question doesn't indicate that I misjudged my audience and went too high concept when I should have been doing Fed gossip, because of course I can do Fed gossip for hours. That's my main job in life. So let me just speak briefly about the Fed transition and the comparison to the Bank of England and maybe some other central banks. So I had the opportunity to co-author with Ben Bernanke, now it's 17 years ago, a major book on central banking and how you should run monetary policy. And at that time, I was starting life as a Federal Reserve Bank of New York economist. It turns out it was very lucky for me the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago turned down my application, because that meant I was at Fed New York instead and had that opportunity. But anyway, I digress. The reason I'm bringing that up is not to establish my bona fides or anything. It's to say that at that time, former Chairman Bernanke, was very far ahead of the curve, in my opinion. I certainly agreed with him, but he was obviously the senior author, in saying we want to depersonalize monetary policy. That too much power and too much perception of power had been concentrated in the person of the chairman, at that point, Alan Greenspan, and that you wanted to move the Fed, and for that matter, most central banks, to systems that were a little more rules-based, much more transparent, and much less about the whims of any one individual. And I remember when Greenspan was reappointed for the umpteenth time in, I think it was 2000 or 2001, Ben, our co-author Rick Mishkin, and I put an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal saying, well, this is all very nice and good, but Plato warned us about philosopher kings, that their sons aren't necessarily as good as the kings, and therefore it would be nice, no matter how good you think Greenspan is, it would be nice to have a system that isn't all about one individual. And in fact, I did the first draft of the article, and I had an opening paragraph about, imagine if poor Alan Greenspan dropped dead on the tennis court, what would happen? And the Wall Street Journal editors wisely decided I shouldn't include that in the op-ed. Anyway, so fast forward now 14 years. Ben Bernanke has stepped down as chairman of the Federal Reserve. And during his time, in addition, what of course he's going to be most remembered for is quantitative easing and the emergency response he took to the financial crisis. But institutionally, what he's going to be most remembered for, and already is spoken about, is the way he opened up the Fed. He made the processes of decision much more transparent. He gave many more news conferences, news appearances, and actually took questions rather than being intentionally obfuscating. He let the other members of the FOMC, particularly the Reserve Bank presidents, speak out a lot more in public and contradict him a lot more in public than either Volcker or Greenspan ever did. I personally think this was the right thing to do. I think it was the right thing to do in terms of just principles of good governance. I think it was the right thing to do because the Fed would have been under even more fire had it not made this initiative to engage more with the public. And I think it was the right thing to do because it let out some of the internal pressures of division in what were very tough decisions. But what this means is now we get to Janet Yellen taking over, and now having taken over as the first female chair of the Federal Reserve Board. And we had lots of drama running up to her appointment, most of which was uncalled for, most of which was caused by a very bad selection process by this president, not who he picked, but how he ran it. It was an embarrassment, frankly, and it was totally unfair to the people involved, including, but not just Janet. But in the end, we had this transition, and markets didn't blink. There was absolutely no ripple with the announcement of Janet, with the appointment of Janet, and with Janet's first meeting. I shouldn't refer to her as Janet, as the Chair Yellen's first meeting. And I'm not sure that would have been the case in the past. In fact, I know it wasn't because Ken Kuttner used to be at Fed Chicago, and I did a study of this. And when Bernanke was appointed to replace Greenspan, and when Greenspan was appointed to replace Volcker, there was actually some real volatility in the markets and something of a sell-off in each case. And we've now reached a point where that's not happening. Now, that doesn't mean that no matter what Chair Yellen and her committee do, their markets won't sell off. They could do something stupid or wrong or misguided, and bad things would happen. But I think it's a healthy development for which Ben Bernanke deserves the lion's share of the credit, that there is much less division's the wrong word, sorry. There's much less association of Fed policies with the specific individual who happens to be the chair at any given time. Now, just to compare to Bank of England if you want, or as part of the reason I was fortunate enough to be a member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, which is the UK's rough equivalent to the FOMC, is because they had already, in part based on some things we wrote, starting in '97, created a committee structure that really was a committee. So there is what they call a governor, which is the equivalent of chairman, and that person is the most powerful, but in the end, they're only one vote. And individual members were given much more room to speak out, and the governor was allowed to lose votes, something the Federal Reserve would never, ever allow to happen. Now, I ideally hope and think that means that we ended up with better policy because there was more open debate and more individual accountability. I cannot prove that in any way, shape, or form. But just to say, I think there's been a very healthy, for all the fixation that you rightly remark on about central banks doing unconventional measures and doing very large interventions and getting into things they shouldn't get into and all this stuff, I think there's been a very healthy development that in the US, in the UK, I would argue in Japan, in Switzerland, where the central banks are much more open and much more accountable than they ever were. And the European Central Bank is a noticeable exception to this. And I think that's part of the problem.
Thank you. We have some student groups here from DePaul or Lake Forest School of Management. Any questions from the students? Okay, we'll go back to everyone else then. Yeah, the woman right there, please.
I've bored the students into sleep. That's good.
Thank you very much for your time today. In 2008...
Could you put the mic closer to your mouth, please?
Sorry, yes. In 2008, during the height of the financial crisis, it was reported that banks in Dubai and Turkey who used Islamic finances done so much better than other banks. Part of it was also reported that because they did not set borrowers to fail, they let them pay the entire debt amount before the set time. If they were able to, they also agreed on the interest rate and never changed it during the time they had to pay the money. What's your input on that? Thank you.
I think you have some of the facts right, but I would interpret them slightly differently. That there is no question that during the global financial crisis, on average, the financial institutions, the large financial institutions associated with Islamic lending had been more conservative and gotten into less trouble. That was not universal. You may recall that Dubai the big financial center in the Gulf region, actually had a horrible real estate boom and bust, and the other members of the Gulf states, particularly Abu Dhabi, actually bailed them out. So it wasn't perfect, but it was on average a better record. And my interpretation would be that it wasn't Islamic banking per se in form, but it was some of the spirit of Islamic banking in the following sense. That I mentioned earlier what I thought were the components of financial stability. Part of Islamic banking is that it is very difficult for a lender to fully offload a loan and not have an ongoing stake or collateral or equity stake or something in it. And we know that part of the problem in the US, particularly in the mortgage market, for example, was that banks would make loans and then immediately sell them, and so they didn't care whether the loans went sour or not. A second piece of it is, again, I think it's in the spirit, but not necessarily the letter of the law of Islamic banking, that they, during this period, maintained higher standards for people having down payments, larger down payments, having, and you could argue that's the effect of what I just said, that the banks had more at stake, so they behaved more responsibly. The reason I'm being a little hesitant is because there are, and there have been demonstrated through the years, some weaknesses of Islamic banking. In particular, you mentioned the idea that the interest rates don't vary. For a large number of products, which is how financial services people refer to different kinds of loans and investments, for a large number of products, actually having variable interest rates is a good thing. It means the economy is not, the credit system of the economy is not so subject to volatile swings. And one could argue that the flexible rate loans on mortgages that existed in this country ran into less trouble than the mortgages which had fixed rates and where the rates were kept very high even after the crisis occurred. So it's something of a mixed bag, but sort of the small c conservatism of Islamic banking as sort of a broad approach, I think did show well during the crisis.
Thanks. Right here in the front row, Phil Levy, our senior fellow on the global economy.
Thanks, Adam. I wanted to give you a chance to weigh in on trade a little. And in particular...
Well, I will let you weigh in, but anyway, yeah.
Well, so the interesting thing from today was that apparently Ambassador Froman said that it was really going to be up to Congress to move any trade negotiating authority. This wasn't going to be a big push from the White House. Where do you see that leading for the global economy?
Trying to think how far I want to go with this. I am not shocked, but very disappointed to hear that Mike Froman said that. So, bless you. So here's the deal. In line with some of the things I said about China, apply to trade more broadly. And so there's a vast number of people, primarily on the left side of the Democratic Party, some with union ties, but also some parts of the Tea Party aspect of Republicans, who are very suspicious of trade. And they believe that trade has destroyed jobs, and they believe that trade puts the U.S. at a disadvantage, and trade drives down workers' salaries. We have a huge amount of evidence out there, which you're well familiar with and you've contributed to, that shows that is simply not true. And that when you think about, even if you take seriously some of those anti-trade people's statements about jobs destroyed by trade, it just doesn't even make any sense. There are 150 million jobs, roughly speaking, in the U.S. economy. In any given year, I think it's up to 20 million of them are created and destroyed. And when we talk about the number destroyed by trade in any given year, it's usually something in a few hundred thousands, under a million. So how do you distinguish, you know, the job that's destroyed supposedly by Chinese competition versus the job that's destroyed because Netflix beats out Blockbuster and all the Blockbuster stores get closed? You can't. But politically, you can. Politically, you can sit there and you can say, I'm the representative of such and such a district, and I am sick to death that this paper mill was, you know, an NPR will do a story and whoever will do a story. This paper mill was shut down because of cheap Chinese competition. And this is a crime, and we got to do something about this. When, of course, you know, the next congressional district over, it was, you know, the Kodak film processing plant that was shut down because we now use digital photos. And nobody's rushing to help those people. And yet there's a cost to favoring the people from the paper plant, a literal cost that's imposed on every working person in this country if they have to pay more for everything they import, and they have less opportunity to ship stuff abroad when we start protectionist, putting up barriers. And I hope this is all preaching to the choir, and maybe it's not. I know with Phil it is. You know, and I very strongly believe we should have a much stronger safety net, a much stronger welfare state in this country for all workers. And it's one of the signs of the perversity of American economic politics that we view the trade and welfare state as being in competition. Whereas if you leave the US out of it, in every part of the world there's a positive correlation between how open you are to trade and how big your welfare state is. Think of Germany, think of Sweden. So anyways, there's a huge amount of scapegoating for trade. Another part of the issue is people on the left in the US, and I've talked with Barney Frank, the recently retired congressional leader, about this, and on the record, as well as off the record. People on the left, in particular supporters of unions, are just incredibly frustrated. They can't get anything they want. I might support some of the things they want, but be that as it may, they can't get it. You know, we're fighting still about the minimum wage. We're fighting about various NLRB rulings. We're fighting about right to work. We're fighting about all these things. Unions can't get delivery of those from Congress. But if they can stand up on trade and block a trade bill, they can still say to their membership, we did something. And so unfortunately, I think there was briefly a sincere intent, and this is what Barney Frank used to talk about, to hold trade hostage. The idea being that big business would be willing, this is the notion, and it's not entirely misguided, would have enough at stake in wanting a trade deal to go through that they would trade off giving something good for labor or working people in return for getting the trade deal passed. And there was a brief period in the 80s when things seemed to work that way, but over the last 20 years, it just hasn't worked. I mean, basically, big business has largely gotten what it wanted, and no trade has gone through, but unions haven't gotten anything. So it's very frustrating. And so it was a very pleasant surprise 13 months ago that the president, at the start of his new term, in his State of the Union address, made direct reference to wanting to do a transatlantic trade and investment partnership. And though he didn't mention in the State of the Union, had his most trusted friend made U.S. Trade Representative Michael Froman, and Mike Froman was talking a very positive, aggressive, affirmative game about trade ties across the Pacific, service trade, as well as European trade. And what we found is Mike, Ambassador Froman, and the politicians of the White House have decided in their infinite wisdom that they do not want to go to bat on this because they think it will lose loyalty of the left wing of the party and or it will cost them seats in the congressional election. And you know, I'm not a politician. I can't make that judgment. I find it a suspect judgment because they've been making that judgment repeatedly for the last several electoral cycles, putting off anything trade or anything international for the sake of playing it safe and finding that they still lose seats in the Congress. And we find that, you may recall, in the primaries of 2008, then Senator Clinton ran much more protectionist, anti-trade than Senator Obama, although he was hardly a friend of trade, and that didn't win her the race. And you may recall that in the last electoral campaign, the both Romney and Obama ran various spots about attacking trade deals on both sides and trying to get votes for that, and both of them ended up ceasing to run those spots towards the end of the election because they were nowhere near as effective as the other spots they could run on much more central topics. But the political assessment has been made that they're just going to be cowards about this. And it's shameful. It's shameful for the benefit of American economy, but it's more importantly, and Ken Tam can speak to this, you can speak to this, Phil, that it's shameful for America's global strategy. Just to give you two, and JD can speak about this, just to give you two examples. First, we're looking across the Pacific. For all I said about China not being an economic threat, China is quite arguably a national security threat. And if you're one of our allies like Japan or Korea, you feel that very real. And part of the point of doing the Trans-Pacific Partnership, of doing a trade deal, was to get, Korea's not part of it, but Japan and Indonesia and Vietnam and Chile and Mexico and a bunch of Pacific countries that are aligned with us to feel even the US is even more involved and has their back, and frankly to be better able to stand up to China in the region and not have Singapore or Malaysia say, well, hell, the US isn't really here, I might as well just go make a deal with the Chinese. And similarly in Europe, and again, JD can speak about this better than I can, there was a very strong concern on the part of the German government and some other governments that US was pivoting to Asia and was going to ignore Europe. But now that we've pulled out all the troops and the Cold War's over and all this, and we need something to maintain the relationship, and actually having deepening economic ties would be a way of affirming that we think Europe still matters to us and is not just a bunch of old people with museums, which frankly is the way a lot of Congress thinks of Europe. And we're throwing that away. So I'm sorry, maybe, I hope this is the rant you intended to elicit from me. And if you can improve on it, please do, and I'll happily give you a chance to say a similar rant at our shop in Washington. But I mean, bottom line, it's just so short-sighted, and it's just a shame. To be clear, what's the it? The Obama administration's capitulation to mistaken congressional worries about trade. That's what's a short-sighted, shameful thing.
Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, that's all we have time for, but please thank me and join me in thanking Dr. Posen for his comments.
Thank you very much.